More Australians are enjoying reinstated freedoms today, with West Australians and Tasmanians back in the cafes. But it sounds like the Queensland border could still be closed for quite some time. And there's been another coronavirus death reported this morning, a man in his 60s from New South Wales. On the international front, there'll be a lot of interest in this meeting tonight in Switzerland, with a push for a comprehensive investigation into the origins of COVID-19 and how efforts to stop its spread have been handled. OK, so our key developments in our coronavirus coverage today. Restrictions will ease today in Western Australia, where up to 20 people are allowed to gather both indoors and outdoors, including at pubs, restaurants and at weddings. And from this morning, Tasmanians can also dine in at cafes and restaurants, but only 10 people at a time. Meanwhile, some schools in South Australia and the ACT are reopening, with mixed feelings from parents. Fast food giant McDonald's has closed 12 outlets in Melbourne for deep cleaning after a delivery driver tested positive for coronavirus. Meanwhile, Cedar Meats, the abattoir at the centre of one of the country's biggest clusters, is set to reopen in part today. 62 countries have backed the call for a comprehensive international investigation into coronavirus. The motion will be put to a key World Health Organization meeting taking place tonight in Switzerland. Brazil's outbreak is now the fourth largest in the world. Brazil now has more than 236,000 cases, behind the US, Russia and the UK. However, Brazil has just a fraction of the testing seen in those countries. And India has extended its 2-month lockdown by 2 weeks after reporting nearly 5,000 new cases. OK, so let's take a look at some of those elements in detail now. Tasmania has had no new cases recorded in the past 24 hours. Restaurants and cafes are gearing up to reopen today, but not all are throwing open their doors. Laura Beavis reports from Hobart.
Today marks the first stage of the restrictions being eased. There's a 3-stage process being set out. Today's the first. From today, people can have up to 5 visitors to their home, and for public gatherings, the maximum limit is lifting to 10 people, and 10 is really the magic number here. So cafes and restaurants can reopen, but with a maximum of 10 patrons inside at a time, with social distancing in place. Parks are reopening with playgrounds, play equipment, boot camps all back on. But again, there's that maximum of 10 people allowed to be doing that, and they've still got to be 1.5 metres apart. On the border restrictions, Tasmanians from today, if they have a residential address in Tasmania, they can self-isolate at home for 2 weeks instead of doing that mandatory 2-week quarantine in a police-patrolled hotel. Community and library facilities can reopen, again with the 10 people rule. And the rules for the advice for vulnerable people, those who are elderly, who have chronic conditions or suppressed immune systems, the advice for them is still that they stay at home and be careful there. But for the rest of us, there's a bit more freedom from today.
And Laura, how are cafes and restaurants there in Tasmania planning to handle the restrictions? How are they going to be enforced?
Well, there's a bit of a mixed approach. We spoke to quite a few cafe and restaurant owners yesterday. One thing to note is a lot of them won't be reopening from today because the 10-person rule just makes it not financially viable for them with the expense of staff and setup. They just can't reopen. But for those who are, many of them are still going to focus on takeaway. Others have told us they're trying to avoid at the moment making patrons make bookings, but instead they'll be, I suppose, letting people in 10 at a time, and they've got to keep those tables 1.5 metres apart, so it's going to be interesting to see how those venues cope. We did ask the Premier last week if police were actually going to be out enforcing this, perhaps patrolling parks and playgrounds and making sure that was all working. We didn't get a concrete answer, but I think we can expect to see if there's obvious groups of more than 10 people congregating either at cafes, restaurants or parks, that they'll be pulled up, and those restrictions that are still in place are going to be enforced pretty tough.
And Laura, did you notice this morning on your way to do this live cross from home whether there were many people out already starting to enjoy the reinstated freedoms, or does it kind of not kick in for a couple of hours yet?
Oh, I think we saw last week when we went out to the national parks when they reopened, there's always a group of keen people who are wanting to get out and experience the freedom straight away. Definitely there's more traffic on the roads today, and those cafes that you drive past, you can see sort of the lines of people going in for their coffee. We're going to go out and try to find some playgrounds and some parks and see what people are doing there. But one challenge might be that a lot of them in Tasmania have actually had temporary fencing put around them. It'll be interesting to see whether councils take that away early, or even if there might be some that might stay shut for a bit longer, because there is some concern that a whole lot of people might flock to them, and that would be a problem.
Laura Beavis there in Tassie. Let's head to Victoria now, where 6 new cases have been recorded in the past 24 hours. Reporter Stephanie Ferrier is in Melbourne.
There have been 6 new cases of coronavirus detected in Victoria. They include 2 that relate to this new McDonald's outbreak, and we understand that they are close contacts of this delivery driver. 3 others are returning travellers who are already in quarantine in hotels, and the last case relates to a person who's tested positive. They're in a close contact of somebody who's already in home isolation with coronavirus. So no unknown cases. However, this new scare at McDonald's is causing some concerns. Now, I'm here at Laverton North, which is one of the outlets in Melbourne's West. It's one of 12 outlets that McDonald's has now closed as a precaution. And I've seen quite a few people come along and realise that there's signs on the door saying it's closed. We've had a lot of disgruntled customers driving up to the drive-through, then driving off and yelling out, "Where's our coffee?" But the CEO, Andrew Gregory, has said that, it is a difficult decision to make and deprive customers of their breakfast routine. However, it's an important step to take after this delivery driver tested positive. Now, at the time, he was completely asymptomatic and didn't even know that he had COVID-19, but he did attend about 12 outlets around Melbourne's north and east. And there would have been at least a couple of workers, according to Andrew Gregory, who interacted with him. And so they've all been sent home into quarantine and will all get tested, as well as any of the workers who had shifts after this delivery driver. Now, the outlets that are affected and are now closed include Melton East, Laverton North, which is where I am now, Yallambee, Taylors Lakes, Campbellfield, Sunbury, Hoppers Crossing, Riverdale Village, Sandown, the Calder Highway, both the outbound and inbound outlets, as well as the BP Rockbank Service Centre outbound as well. Now, Andrew Gregory said that it's understood customers shouldn't be concerned because this person mainly related to the workers, but all of these outlets will be subjected to a deep clean, and they won't be reopened until the company can find alternative workers from other franchises. Now, this, of course, follows another cluster at the Faulkner McDonald's in Melbourne's north.
Yeah, and it was kind of reopened reasonably quickly, wasn't it, the Faulkner McDonald's?
Yeah, so that's got some other workers that have come through from other facilities. But obviously all of the people involved in that particular concern and that cluster, they're at home being quarantined at this stage.
And they've got to organise a heap more stuff with 12 of these McDonald's closing, so maybe it'll take a bit longer. We'll see what happens with that. And Steph, what's happening with the Cedar Meats abattoir? That's the number of people connected with that is kind of up around 100 now, isn't it? The number of people infected.
That's right, Joe. I think it's up to about 99 cases at the moment, but it is opening its doors again as of this morning. We were down there earlier this morning and saw some of the workers arriving. Now, this is not going to be up full-scale production again, but it is operating at a minimal basis, and that is just the cold storage facility. So I understand that's where a lot of the frozen meat is processed up to get ready for export. Now, the company says that it is following all the guidelines set out by the Health Department here in Victoria, and the Health Department has also confirmed that all the workers that are coming back today have tested negative. We don't know whether or not they have previously had coronavirus and recovered, or if they've just always tested negative. So good news for some of those workers down there that are starting up again, albeit slowly.
And what's the news on the Victorian economy?
Yes, of course. Well, It's hoped that some of these jobs will be able to ramp up and help the economy here. But the government has just announced a $2.7 billion infrastructure blitz. Now, what they're hoping to do is fast-track some projects that were already in the pipeline, as well as create some completely new projects too. They're talking about some 57,000 Housing Commission units that they're going to refurbish as of next week, so they'll start working on those straight away and give tradies a real boost. They're also looking at new road projects as well as train stations, and more than $1 billion which will be tipped into schools as well. So the government is certainly hoping that they will be able to build their way out of some of this crisis here that we're facing. And this, of course, follows a big business package to help businesses that are really struggling with payroll, tax relief and the like.
Stephanie Ferry reporting there from Victoria. New South Wales has recorded one new coronavirus death, taking Australia's total to 99. The man in his 60s had underlying health conditions and was a close contact of a known case. Just one new infection has been recorded from almost 6,000 tests.
As we know, the number of tests always dips on a weekend, and I expect to have a similar number of tests reported tomorrow, but we really need people to come forward and get tested. If you have the slightest symptom, the mildest symptom, please come forward and get tested. We know that as people feel more confident about the workplace, about moving around the community, they do want to look at their options about moving around. And we said last week, and we say it again this week, if you want to use public transport in the peak, we recommend firstly that you check the apps available, which tell you what services do have some capacity in the peak. But because we are strictly adhering to social distancing, we recommend that people who aren't already on the system in the peak, especially on buses and trains, travel in the off-peak, so after 10 a.m. or before 2 p.m, in order to make sure that social distancing is there. We don't want people to either get the virus or spread the virus on public transport. There'll be deep cleaning, there'll be extra measures in place. There'll also be special identifications of where you should be sitting or standing on the mode of transport, so you'll have that advice as well, which is being rolled out from this morning.
Gladys Berejiklian there. In Queensland, all but one person at a Rockhampton aged care home have been tested and returned negative results after that nurse tested positive last week. An investigation has been launched into how the nurse continued to work while showing symptoms.
There has been an incredible effort from the HHS, from Queensland Health and from the ambulance service since 8 p.m. on Thursday night when we were notified of this positive case. 35 residents have now been moved to other facilities here in Rockhampton, including the Mater, Hillcrest and the Rockhampton Hospital. That has allowed residents to be moved around within the facility and allowed us to locate 39 of the Ivy Baker residents, of the Westwood residents in private rooms where they can be isolated with their own bathrooms and infection control can be implemented. There are further residents being moved today around within the centre, and we expect that to be completed by mid-morning. That means that all 39 of those residents who are thought to be contacts of the positive case will have single bedrooms and bathrooms. That 42 close contacts have been identified and tested. The centre itself is in lockdown today. All tests have returned negative. In addition, 763 Rockhampton locals have sought testing at the 3 testing locations here available in Rockhampton, and all of those that have been returned are negative. The Nursing Centre and the HHS have set up a dedicated team to work with residents and their families. That includes nursing and social work staff. And so if you have a family member here at the centre and you would like any information 24 hours, 7 days a week, you should contact 13 Health and they will be able to to put you through to that dedicated teams. We've also deployed iPads into the centre so that families can continue to retain contact with their family members who are residents here but who will be locked down for some time potentially.
Yeah, so really encouraging news there out of Rockhampton, because there was such deep concern back on Friday when news had come through that a nurse had been working at that nursing home while they were displaying symptoms and they were contagious, and they'd been working for several days. And considering what's happened in other nursing homes around the world, there was a lot of concern about what could happen there. So really good news that they've tested all the staff and residents there and none have tested positive. They're still waiting just to test one of the staff member, but of course they've got to keep a close eye on that over the next 2 weeks or so. And just in terms of the numbers of new cases reported broadly in Queensland, 2 new cases reported in Queensland in the last 24 hours, and both of those are people who'd returned from overseas. Now, the Morrison government hopes China will get on board with a push to establish an inquiry into the cause of the coronavirus outbreak. More than 60 countries have now thrown their weight behind a motion that will be considered at a meeting of the World Health Assembly tonight. Diplomats are still locked in negotiations, but the federal government says it expects the motion to be endorsed. Political reporter Noor Hader joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Noor, g'day, so what's the latest?
Yeah, Joe, global momentum is growing behind the Morrison government's push to establish an inquiry into the coronavirus pandemic. The World Health Assembly is meeting later today in Geneva, where nations will vote on a European Union motion co-sponsored by Australia to establish a independent investigation to look into the outbreak. Already there are 62 nations, a vast array of nations, including the United Kingdom, Indonesia, Japan and India, backing this motion. It calls for an impartial and comprehensive evaluation of the health response. Now, the motion doesn't specifically name China or Wuhan. The language has been moderated, but it would essentially pave the way for field missions to be launched to go in and examine how the virus transferred from animals to humans. Now, at this stage, the motion doesn't have the support of China or the United States, although negotiations are ongoing. We heard from the Federal Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, earlier this morning, and he's urging China to get behind this push, which he says will help the world prevent future pandemics.
I hope that China will participate. I hope China will come on board at the World Health Assembly, joining many other nations in supporting the obvious need for an inquiry into COVID-19, its origins, its handling right across the world, because we've had a circumstance where hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions of people have lost their jobs, billions of people have had their lives disrupted, and the least the world can expect is an inquiry that allows us to learn the lessons so that we can try to avoid a repeat of this in the future.
Brazil has now passed the total number of coronavirus cases in Italy, with more than 230,000 infections. Brazil is behind only the US, Russia and Britain, with the 4th largest COVID-19 caseload in the world. Hopes of India's lockdown ending soon have been dashed, with restrictions extended by another 2 weeks in most areas. Schools, restaurants and places of worship will remain closed until at least next month. India has more than 90,000 confirmed coronavirus cases. Spain's daily coronavirus death toll has fallen below 100 for the first time since the middle of March. 87 people died in Spain in the past 24 hours. This week, Spain will significantly ease lockdown laws in several areas, but not in its 2 biggest cities of Barcelona and Madrid. And thousands of happy shoppers have been out in force in Thailand after the country opened malls for the first time in weeks. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has admitted new lockdown rules are causing frustration. New polling has shown growing dissatisfaction with his government's response to the pandemic. Nick Dole reports from London.
Over the weekend in parks around London, new rules have been put to the test. People are now allowed to see one other person from another household in a park or an open space, as long as they keep their distance. England has ditched the stay-at-home slogan. It's now using the phrase "stay alert," and that's created some confusion and frustration, especially in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, where the stay-at-home message is still front and centre. And you can understand why those governments are reluctant to change their messaging. More than 3,000 people across the UK are still testing positive daily. And the death toll here is over 34,000 and still rising. The Prime Minister's written an opinion piece today acknowledging the messaging is now more complex than it was and admitting there is a sense of frustration in the community. And the polls are reflecting that. There's been a big shift in just a week, and for the first time there are now more people dissatisfied with the government's response than those who approve. Elsewhere in Europe, there are some bright spots. For the first time since the lockdown, Spain has recorded fewer than 100 deaths a day, although the government will still seek to extend the state of emergency there for another month. And Italy's lockdown is about to ease, allowing shops, bars and restaurants to reopen on a regional basis, and people will be allowed to move around their own regions as well. The government says it may well trigger an increased infection rate, but it says that's a calculated risk. The situation in Russia remains of serious concern. There were nearly 10,000 new cases in a single day there on Sunday. Here in Britain, the government's just announced plans to spend $180 million to fast-track efforts to find a vaccine for the coronavirus. But even the usually positive Boris Johnson admits it may not come to fruition.